Thank you so much. I really appreciate the intro. Thank you, Alex, and Gabby, for your future help in the polls and the interactivity. Thank you so much for those of you who are joining us in virtual digital GovLand. This is a new departure for the Plain Language Action and Information Network, which is a group of federal employees or employees in the federal government who are interested in plain language and following the Plain Writing Act of 2010. We have normally done all of our training in person, but that is obviously not working. So we decided we had to do some online training to make sure people got the word and the training they wanted. So if you think of any questions that you have, please put them in the chat. Alex will be periodically reminding me of questions, and if there's something urgent, he'll let me know as well. I'm just hoping that my condo doesn't have a fire alarm, because normally whenever I hold one of these online trainings, they decide to test the fire alarm system. So if that happens, if it's not a test, I'll let everyone know and we'll figure out what to do. So this is Plain Language Basics, and I'm Catherine Spivey. I'm co-chair of the Plain Language Action and Information Network, as Alex told you, and you can find a great deal more information about that at plainlanguage.gov. So let's get started. Okay. One of the things that's always kind of difficult is figuring out what are the course objectives, what are you going to learn, what am I going to focus on. So we thought we'd start with how to recognize plain language techniques, or which ones are going to be useful, what you can use to improve writing, and therefore how to write in plain language and why you have to. And you'll learn a lot more about how the Plain Writing Act of 2010 affects what and how you write. And that will depend on your job, although you have probably heard from any other writing class that you've ever taken that plain language, plain writing, whatever you're calling it, is a best practice. You'll learn more about the law. And we'll work on how you can develop your skills, because that's always sort of, where do I go next? Always something to consider. So this is at any rate what I'm going to be discussing today. So why plain language? And this is going to depend on your agency. I am assuming right now that most of you work for the federal government, and there are specific missions that particular agencies have. I work for the General Services Administration, and GSA is essentially mission support for other federal agencies. So we handle real estate, we handle acquisition, we do technology. There's a lot of that. And of course, your agency will have a specific mission. And to do our job at GSA, we have to be able to communicate with users, customers, longstanding, new, people at all different places on a spectrum of understanding what it is. And we have to make it clear, because we want to make sure that people and other agencies get what they need. So for example, I used to work in the branch of GSA that does IT, buys and sells IT. And we wanted to make sure that if, say, FEMA during a hurricane needed laptops, that we could get them laptops, that was easy and straightforward. And to do that amount of customer service, to get that kind of support, the service we want to give, we have to use plain language, because we don't want people sitting there thinking, why don't they say anywhere on their site the word laptop? Because what I want is a laptop. So, there's a lot involved with that. So think about what your agency does and how plain language fits in. I am going to add a note which is not on the slide, but it is worthwhile Googling your agency and the words plain language or plain writing, because a lot of agencies, and I'll show you later when we're going through exercises, a lot of agencies have plain language pages which no one knows about. So, if you're interested in doing more or learning more or anything like that, or, finding out what your agency is doing, definitely look for that plain language or plain writing page. I get a lot of emails from people saying, I want training. I don't know what my agency's doing, and I Google, and I'm able to say, oh, well, they have a point of contact, they have someone coordinating training, and they have monthly meetings or whatever it is. So take that step first. That's a useful place to start. So plain language, customer service, helping our users, helping our members, helping the public. As I said, GSA, we have varying degrees of contact with the public, but anyone not GSA is public for us. So that's how we've defined it. So what is plain language? And when I tell people what I do, I think first off they worry that I'm going to quiz them on grammar, which I don't do. I guess they've had unfortunate experiences. But plain language is content, and I use the word content a lot. You could always use text or words or material or anything like that. But something's in plain language if your audience can find what they need. Finding is really important. If it is a footnote on page 62 in a 184-page PDF, that is not findable. That's not plain language. If they can understand what they find the first time. How many of you have gotten just emails, where you're like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Does this apply to me? Does this not apply to me? I'm not sure. I don't know what I need to do. And the last part of this definition is people have to be able to use what they've read or what they've heard, because this could be a speech as well or testimony. They have to be able to use it. So don't give people information they can't use. Don't give them information that's hard to understand, and don't hide it. These are like the 3 rules. And for the definition. And you may have heard earlier I said plain language, plain writing. I am only qualified to talk about plain English, but there are plain language efforts going in other countries with other languages. I just can't talk about them. The industry standard, from what I've been able to gather, is moving toward clear communications. All of these mean mostly the same thing. Whenever I'm talking about the Plain Writing Act, though, it's always plain writing. It's not the Plain Language Act. And, there's also a bigger emphasis now on the visual, the design element in plain language, and there'll be a little bit more of that later on. I should remind everyone that this is being recorded and it will be posted on DigitalGov with the slides and perhaps the exercises afterwards. So if you came in a little late, I just wanted to reassure you that you can catch the beginning of it. So what plain language is not? Now, sometimes I start talking about plain language and people say, oh, that's just dumbing things down, or that's writing to a 6th grade level. And there's some other elements. It's grammar, it's style guide, it's imprecise, it's making it easier, making it simpler, making it less accurate, less technical. And it's very hard to answer without a specific piece in front of me. That's always difficult. But this is one of the things you can do. What have you heard about plain language the most? If you have heard anything about what plain language is, but it's not actually, put your answers in the chat. And also, what surprises you the most that people think plain language is certain things? So that's one thing. So You know, people say, oh, it's grammar or style guide, and it's not. I mean, we're not, plain language never says, oh, don't use grammar. I mean, many of us came from editorial backgrounds, and it's really hard to shut off grammar. But just because something is grammatical does not necessarily mean that it's in plain language. Those are two separate things. And it's not a style guide issue. I mean, the last month or so, I've been doing a lot of document review, and you know, if I see a style guide thing, I'll mention it because GSA follows AP style in certain things. I know other agencies follow other things, but you know, you can have content that follows a style guide slavishly, and it can still not be plain. So these are sort of different routes, you know, different things to look for, but they're not plain language. I'm happy to talk a little bit later if you have questions about writing to a certain grade level. It's very important to know who your readers are, and some of that applies to reading level, but you know, it should always be simpler than we think, because we can't guarantee who's coming for what reason. Like, for example, I am reasonably expert in editorial issues. So if I'm reading something about editorial or plain language, you know, I've got that. If you put me over on a tax site or a science site, I'm busted down to the lowest, the beginner level. So there's some things we know and don't know about our audiences, but you can write to a grade level. Usually that's Flesch Kincaid or the Gunning Fog Index. You can do that by writing shorter sentences and using shorter words, but that's not a guarantee of making it plain. It's a good indicator sometimes, and I've done some work with that, but it's not a guarantee of plain language. There are some short scientific terms that are very difficult. So it's not making things less technical, it's judging whether your audience needs that level. You know, you really do have to make some, we hope, informed judgment calls on how technical it can be. But it's none of these things. It is writing for your actual reader, not your preferred. Like my preferred reader, anyone reading anything that I've been put together, is relaxed, not stressed, doesn't have any upcoming deadlines, is perfectly comfortable, and you know, a cup of tea. You know, that's my ideal reader with my working vocabulary. I never get that. Never. Never, never, never. If they have the vocabulary, they don't have the tea, or their air conditioners on the fritz or whatever. I mean, we don't get people in perfect situations. So, you know, that's another element of when people come to our sites, you know, government websites, federal government websites, they're trying to do something, and they're not trying to do something for fun. You know, they have a task to do, they have to do it, and unfortunately, it is often the case that federal websites are not particularly helpful. So plain language is not these things as we, you know, get to a better understanding of what plain language is. So what we can talk about, we got a poll, yay. I'm not going to answer the poll because, I mean, my answer wouldn't count. But what governs plain language? We have the Plain Writing Act of 2010, and I'm going to interrupt right now to say the International Plain Language Day is October 13th, and this year is the 10th year anniversary, which is very exciting, and we have some executive orders. You can look at some more information if you want to read more about it in the final guidance at plainlanguage.gov/law. You can just see that in the top navigation, and you can go straight to that. So there's a lot of information about plain writing and government websites and executive orders. There was a I think a 40, 50 year history of plain language efforts before we actually got the law. Writing to a certain grade level, yay. Interesting to see all of these results. Thank you so much. So we do have the Plain Writing Act of 2010. Okay. So for the Plain Writing Act of 2010, it says that all new government documents that meet the following criteria, documents that are necessary to get government benefits or services or for filing taxes. So that's IRS, that's Social Security, that's all kinds of Medicare, Medicaid, documents that provide information about federal benefits or services. So there's the information, you know, the inform, the education part, and then there's the actually getting it. So one is likely to have a form, and that is a whole different issue, but you know, it's a difficulty. Also, documents that explain to the public how to comply with a federal requirement. So it's these three things. Wow, we got almost a split group on this. Documents that explain to the public how to about information, how to get it, and how to comply. So, you know, this is where the federal government and people interact. So this applies to both paper and electronic letters, publications, forms, notices, instructions, websites, emails, whatever, auto responses, you know, anything. So as long as it falls into one of these three buckets. So a quick poll here. Does the law affect you? Do you write for the public in your job? So, wow. I like this real-time feedback. It's also a good test on how many people take the poll or can take the poll. Perhaps that's a different issue. Okay, looks like it's slowing down a little bit. Yeah. Okay. So this is, you know, the Plain Writing Act, the provisions, who it applies to, what you have to do. Now, there's also another element. I will say right now that many people have heard about plain language, even if they don't know exactly how it applies. And part of that is, I think, been driven by websites, because that turns into, are these websites providing good customer service? Are they centered on the, are they providing user-centered design? Are they focusing on making things easy for the people coming to them? And we sort of got the spillover effect, because plain language is customer service. That is literally using the language that your customers use, or users. There's a couple of different phrases. I'm sorry, words you can use to describe users or customers or whatever. I tend to use those two more or less interchangeably. Now, this is sort of the best practice part of plain language, because if you think about, you know, any kind of communication, and you can do communication even if communication, the word communication isn't in your job title. But if you're using plain language, you can reduce costs, whether directly or indirectly. For example, if you send something out, yeah, and this is the best case scenario, and everybody reads it and they say, yes, I understand this exactly. And then they go do whatever it is they need to do. You're not dealing with a million questions. I used to work for an association. We had an annual conference, and you know, it was in the fall, and starting in July, we would be answering questions about the conference. Now, this was, I had just started that position as websites manager, and I created a page that had all the information we had at that time about the conference. How to register, how to exhibit, you know, how to speak, you know, all those details. And we updated our voicemails to say, You can get more information about the annual conference at theiacp.org/conference. And we got our voicemails back. People went to the website. They were happy to go to the website. They didn't need a phone call. And we were able to breathe, and we weren't barking at people all of the time. Now, that is a indirect benefit because obviously you can't count money, but we had happier staff who were able to focus on other things, and we had happier association members who got the answer they needed without having to wait. You know, because I'll tell you, when your voicemail box fills up, you've got 50 phone calls to make. So, you know, how can you use plain language? How can you get people the information they want? You can use less resources on enforcing. If you've told somebody to do something and they don't understand your instructions and they do it incorrectly, then you have to go back and explain it again, maybe coach them through the process. Some of you may have heard of the story from the state of Washington. The state small business group, I guess it was the tax and revenue group at any rate, sent out a letter to people who were small business owners or self-employed who had bought equipment. I mean, there was some really wacky kind of thing, but they had to pay taxes if they bought equipment online or in another state. I know it makes no sense, but they sent this out, and there was I think it went to about 800 people, and they had a 97% ignore rate. And this is a story told by a plain language practitioner, Jenny Reddish, and she says, there was nothing on the letter that said Department of Tax and Revenue. And it was a confusing small print, really complicated to follow. So she worked on it. She made it clearer. She boiled it down, and they collected, when they resent it, they were able to collect about $400,000, from that tax, which is more than they had anticipated. But if you think about the costs, they had to pay Jenny to redo the letter. They had to resend the letter. They had to print the letter and then post it, send it out in the post. So, that brings about some of the costs of, when you do business and you don't use plain language. You have to deal with questions, you have to look at enforcement, you have to think about, if you're sending out a form or an application, you have to make sure it makes sense and that people can do it. So you have to test it. But if you use plain language, you have to spend less time fixing things. Now, unfortunately, that simply gives you more time for other stuff, because nobody has any free time in the government. But at least you're not fixing stupid stuff, which is, when I get things I don't understand, I feel like they wasted their own time and they're wasting mine. So, one real plain language result that we have, besides that state of Washington one, is something from the Veterans Affairs Office. And this is a lesson for what do I do plain language on. And I just bookmarked I sent it to the plain language listserv, which discussed, what do you do, what form do you fix first, and it applies to plain language. Now, what this office did, is they looked at what letter do we get the most calls about? And that's perfectly valid. If you're thinking about this in terms of websites or, forms or something, you can ask your office mates, what do we have the most problems with? How can we boil this down? And they revised it. Sorry, getting ahead of myself. This particular letter, they were getting 9.4 calls per month per counselor. After the revision, they were getting 1.6. So that was a win. That freed up time for other things. And if you look at it, calls per year times 10 counselors, I mean, that was frees up. I mean, you can see the difference anymore. I'm even more, but it's important to look at either where do I get the biggest result, or what can I do right now? Because sometimes those are not quite the same. So you can see results with plain language, and you can see certain gains, customer service gains, of having more time for other things, not having to answer the same questions all the time, which is a pain, and an easier process all around. And people are more willing to fill out your forms or to do what you need them to do if they know what to do. That makes a big difference. So, excuse me, just checking that. So, how do you write in plain language? And these techniques that we're going to be discussing are from the Federal Plain Language Guidelines, which are mentioned in the Plain Writing Act. And you can see them on plainlanguage.gov. Now, question for you. There's a couple of questions. What techniques have you heard of before? What's your favorite? Or what's easiest? All of these. And we'll just take a quick look at these. There's reader-centered organization. There's design features. There's a new field opening up called content design, which is a really interesting way of looking at plain language. It's using headers and lists and tables. There's also focusing on shortening or reducing sentences and paragraphs, and using pronouns, focusing on active voice and verbs rather than nouns. All of these we're going to be going over, and using less jargon and fewer acronyms. So, okay, very interesting slide here. I mean, poll. I'm liking those results. Very interesting. Jargon and acronyms. That's why we can't have nice things in the federal government, because of that. But no, but there are ways to work around that. One of the things, however, that I find plays a big role in some of this is what's called the curse of knowledge. Is that when you know a field or a topic really, really well, it's really difficult to pull yourself out of jargon and acronyms because you're so used to using them. But it's important to, if you can't do that, to find someone who isn't in that field and see if you can get, does this make sense? Do you understand what I'm trying to convey? So we will be revisiting these in quite extraordinary length later on throughout the rest of the class, rest of the workshop, sorry. So the biggest thing, and this goes back to, as we had discussed, the first part, the first technique, which is reader-centered organization. And you may have heard this in other classes, other courses, any writing course. Who's your audience? Who are you writing for? What is your purpose? Why do they need to read this? What do they need to know? What do they know already? These are some of the things you have to know as you are gauging what to write. Are they expert? Are they novices? Are they beginners in the field? I mean, you really do have to look at that, because that will affect, the direction of your piece and your tone and your word choice, all of those things. You need, of course, and this is difficult, to write for your reader and not for yourself. And this is very difficult as you work with, I'm going to say, experts or senior leaders. You have to focus on the audience rather than the writer. And you have to, instead of asking, what do I want to say or tell them, to focus on what they need to know. Few people, and there are very few instances, need to know your agency's history. People like to bring it out because they feel that it places, where they are, but really people generally don't need to know. And if they need to know, they can go find out. That is not something that's only going to be in your piece. Another part of this is literally writing for your reader. I was working with a group a while ago that was holding an event, and they sent me their copy for their event. And it started with, "We are so proud to offer the in-person industry day." And I said, "You're writing this from the office. You're not writing this for the people you want to come." And they said, "No, we're really interested in having them come." And I said, "But it's all about your office." And I really did have to sit down and say, okay, instead of saying, "We are so proud to offer," you start with, "Please come to our industry day," or "Please attend," or "You're invited," or whatever. But you have to actually put the person in that. So that is sometimes a difficult thing to do. People get very justly, it makes perfect sense that they would get very focused on the event, and sometimes you have to step back and say, what am I actually trying to do? Another element for writing for your reader, not yourself, instead of saying, "What can I do to impress my audience," like with my vocabulary or my beautifully crafted sentences or the elegant composition of my paragraphs, ask what you can do to help your audience. And that is, what's your word choice? What, can you tell what level they might be? Are you dealing with perhaps basic readers? Are you dealing with a form? Because that's, that's a different element. I mean, you have to think of some different things. So, it's sort of taking yourself and your equation out and focus on what your reader needs and what they want to know and how you can help them to that. You have seen this before, I'm sure, in practically any other writing class. But first you include the most important, the facts and figures, and then at the bottom, nice to have but not vital. This is the inverted pyramid, where you make it easy for people to get to what they need. And they don't have to read through to the very end to find out what the point is. You really do have to make that clear. For example, and Alex, if you or Gabby could put this in the chat, what we're going to do is a sort of in-class exercise where we look at a piece of writing and we see what we can do to it to make it more plain. First, we'll look at why doesn't it work? Now, I know that you can all read, but for those of you who are joining by phone, the original newsletter article is, "The Coast Guard has conducted an investigation to determine what carbon monoxide, CO, detection devices are available to recreational boaters such that, when installed and activated, could reduce the risk of being exposed to high levels of CO, that silent killer. A variety of technologies is available for detecting the presence of CO on boats and should be considered by recreational boaters to reduce their risk of injury or death while boating." So, what needs to happen here? Well, I'm going to step back for a moment and not leap into editing, which is what I often do. But what we have is a paragraph, which last time I checked was 72 words. Oh, sorry. That is also 2 sentences. This first sentence is 5 lines. The second is 3 lines. Those are long sentences. There's some puffiness here, conducted an investigation, and this goes back to, again, one of the things that I always think of when I see this Coast Guard thing is, in my former office, we had a training unit, which is very good. You know, good to have education. I'm all for it, education and training. But they sent out an email once that said, you know, we did a pilot study to determine what were the best mandatory classes for our unit. And we talked to 72 people and we conducted 36 interviews and da 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 da. And somewhere I have it saved as an example, but honestly, I didn't care about their pilot study. The whole thing with mandatory training is, what is it? What classes do you want me to take? When do I have to take them? What horrible thing happens if I don't? You know, because usually, you know, we have mandatory training, and if you don't take it, your access to your computer gets yanked. You know, and you have to go through that painful process. So, I mean, that was what I was looking for. I assumed that however they came up with this list of mandatory training was accurate and good, given, you know, no evidence to the contrary. So with this, getting back to the Coast Guard example, we've got a couple of things that we know are wrong. The sentences are too long, some of the verb forms are not good, and it's really hard to get the point, you know. So you might want to think about, you know, what would you do to fix this? Shorter sentences, paragraphs, yeah. It's kind of like Christmas when these little displays come on, all this little blinking lights. Obviously, if we were in an in-person class, I'd be scribbling on the whiteboard, but that's a little bit more difficult to do. But yeah, short sentences, shorter paragraphs. Yeah, that sounds good. I'm going to move on. Try and move on. Something to remember. Okay. So what should you include? And that was the poll. What techniques would you use to fix this? And here's one rewrite. Carbon monoxide is a silent killer. Okay, that gives us something. The Coast Guard recommends that you use a carbon monoxide detection device on your boat to reduce the risk of being exposed to high levels of this deadly gas. You may choose from a variety of devices. Well, that's better, but that second sentence is still like 3.5 lines. You know, and the problem with long sentences isn't that they're long, it's that you lose track of what they're trying to say. You know, sometimes you really have to, you know, shorten sentences so you have points. You know, so we have a further rewrite for that. Carbon monoxide is a silent killer. Boom. That could also be a title, but it goes to the next sentence, the rewrite for this. Use a detection device on your boat. You know, that's one element. I'm going to move this. Yeah. Use a detection device on your boat. It will reduce your risk of being exposed to high levels of this deadly gas and being injured or killed. I am still not thrilled by this, but it's better. You know, there's this, and then there's this, and it's better, and it could be, I think it could be fixed even a little bit more. Now, I should also add that one of the things that happens is we get samples from many different agencies and departments of the federal government, and sometimes we know and can explain some of the context and sometimes not. Like, we know this is from a newsletter. So, you know, if this were a newsletter going to recreational boaters, we would try and maybe make it fit better into a newsletter, because, you know, you can't guarantee recreational boaters, oh, we can assume they have, you know, X amount of tolerance for long sentences. I mean, you just can't do that. So that could still be better. So, okay. So the next thing And something we didn't really look at, although I did mention it a little bit with the Coast Guard sample, where we talked about, you know, you might be able to make silent killer into a header. But headers work and are a really good technique for plain language because they allow the reader to scan. You know, they're looking for relevant, you know, sections, you know, how to apply, who can apply, whatever. It breaks up the information and it gives you a little bit more blank space on the page. As I said, this is part of, you know, this new field called content design. It's not really, I mean, partially it's a little bit of visual comms or graphic design, but you don't really need any design. You just need to know this is too, you know, we need to break up this long paragraph, or, you know, this is getting a little unwieldy. So headers you can do a couple of different ways. You can go by topic, you can use statements, you can use questions. Now, don't really want to get into frequently asked questions right now, but this is where you would look at how do you phrase them? How do you, you know, what do you use? And as you're choosing headers, you want to be consistent. You know, if you start with topic, you know, go ahead and use the topic style. If you start using questions, make all of them as questions, because people's brains like patterns, and you know, it is easier to work your way through a document if it follows the patterns it sets up. Now, this is particularly for questions, and it might be as you're clustering different kinds of questions. If you have like a long list of questions, maybe some of them cluster themselves together. Questions may help readers relate to the information. They put, you know, a U or an I in that. And sometimes the questions can help you organize that information. Like there, for example, I was thinking of USCIS, you might be moving things like, have you applied? Are you waiting to hear back? Did you get a response? You know, ways of organizing things in a process. Yeah, that's just one example. There are many of those. So here are some question headings. Here's some sample headings along these lines. So this is from USCIS, and a question heading that they used for this was, how do I know if I'm eligible to extend my stay in the United States? And they repeat the answer. You may apply for an extension of stay in the United States if, and then you have some bullets. You were lawfully admitted, you had not committed any act, there's no other factor, you submit an application. So that gives, you know, how do I know if I'm eligible? That says, this is your question, here's our answer. Another heading sample is from, I think it's from the VA. It's this, like 2 pages of blurb. You know, this is, it's all one paragraph. You know, here's the thing, you have a pension claim, this is what we need. It's really hard to follow. I won't even say anything about the italics, but you know, this is difficult. You can make that easier for your user by using headers. For example, you know, the intro, we have your claim. We have to ask for more information. It will help us decide whether or not. So your headers are what we need, when we need it, your right to privacy. So, you know, people are mostly, yeah, when do I do it? There's a date. What do they need? They need these things. Medical report, letter, and the guide are enclosed. So this, I hope I'm not making anyone seasick going back and forth, but you know, this is the text, this is hard to follow. The headers make it easier. It also sort of makes you break up a long paragraph into shorter ones. So there's also question headers for this. You could try that as well. What do we need from you? When do we need it? I mean, it's really the same clustering. You're just changing whether you have it a phrase or a question. What are your privacy rights? So, you know, that will depend mostly on what you are, what your content is. It is always a lot easier. It's sometimes good to see content that's not from your agency, just so you can see the example and not work your way through it. It's always easier, I think, editing what you normally do, having seen these other examples. So, bulleted lists. Now, generally, what we use bullets for are if the order of them doesn't matter, and if it's in a process, though, if these are steps in a process, use numbers, because I mean that's sort of an expectation that people have. But if it's just a bulleted list, don't use numbers or letters, because you know that doesn't mean anything. It's also, and this is something I'll show you later on in the slides, is we have a heat map of where people's eyes go on websites, and people look at bulleted lists. They look at headers and they look at bulleted lists because they're set off. They must be important. So just something to remember. Now, this is just as an example. I'm sure you've seen bulleted lists before, but this is what I consider a particularly dense paragraph. It's long and it's like every word is important, but it's actually very hard to read across. You know, and that's one of the reasons that bulleted lists work, where you have, here's all the items. It's easier to scan. One of the things that I'm seeing from some of the research that the Nielsen-Norman group has been doing is that people's online behavior, which is scanning and searching, you know, is being replicated offline. I read a Kindle. I mean, I use my Kindle a lot. I have found myself reading magazines, hitting the side of the page to turn it. So we are learning more and more about how the brain processes information and how that flows back and forth. So our bulleted list is very simply starting from here, go to here. Now that's a particularly long one, but that is going to be a lot easier for people to scan. Another element which comes up a lot in plain language review is, unless you have something that's simply, you know, bullet item, etc., you have to make sure that things are parallel. And we're going to have some exercises in that later. But we have parallelism means that words, phrases, or clauses in the same form are equally important. So for example, here's a GSA example. GSA provides workplaces by constructing, managing, preserving, and leasing and managing. And the boldface items are parallel. They match. They all end in ing. Now, that's, you know, there's nothing magical about this, but again, the brain looks for patterns, and this is one way that you indicate relationship and hierarchy. These things are all equal. Another parallelism example is this one. Each compact must contain provisions required, are in compliance, are consistent with this part. Now, these are not parallel, you know, because how this sentence reads, if you break it out, is each compact must contain provisions required. Okay, that's one bullet. Each compact must contain are in compliance. No, that's not going to work. And the last one, each compact must contain are consistent with this part. So that is not parallel, showing you again. So how do you fix that? So you fix it by making things parallel. Each compact must contain provisions, comply with other applicable federal laws, and be consistent with this part. I am not 100% happy with this, but it is more parallel than these other ones. So, again, there's nothing, I was about to say magical, but I think what I actually mean is difficult about fixing for parallelism. But if you're having sort of complex bulleted lists where you are listing verbs, you have to make sure it's consistent. Generally, it's not that big of a problem. I say that because that's one of the things I like fixing. So, yeah. Another element that comes under design features, which you may or may not have used, is tables. Now, tables serve a very specific purpose. What they really do fundamentally is they make it really, really obvious to see an if-then relationship. Now, I don't know how many of you pay estimated taxes, but for a while I had to do that, and I had, the IRS was sending out booklets, and they sent out their little booklets, and there was a page where, if you live in, this was all in paragraphs, if you can imagine, 2-column paragraphs, like if you live in Virginia, if you live in one of the following states, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, Ohio, whatever, and send your information to Pittsburgh or whatever it was. And it was a huge pain because I had to find a ruler or a straight edge, and I had to literally go line by line because they were using, ridiculously small print, and it was hard to follow. You had to read across. And then suddenly I got one of the booklets that the IRS was putting out, and they had a table of 26 line table, and they said, your state address you send your money to, and I just had to go all the way down to Virginia because thankfully they were in alpha order, and it says, Virginia, send your tax money to Huntsville, Alabama, or whatever it was. And that was huge. I mean, that was so much easier. And if you are in a situation where you are facing if-then logic that is complicated, this is an excellent way to present the information that is easier for your reader to follow. Now, a small example is this, and just imagine it as a paragraph. This would be difficult. You'd have to first figure out what's the money, what's the dollar amount, and then what does the accountable officer do. The hardest part about tables is figuring out what's the header. And it's never going to be a detail like this. It's not going to be a detail, it's going to be a grouping. So we have some of those in our exercises, but tables can be very useful. Think of them, for example, for deadlines. Tables can be really useful. You could have one as, say, date, or the action. Like if you are turning in a proposal to speak, your due date is October 30th, or whatever. But I mean, you can really make it easy and deliver information to your reader. So yeah, let's go ahead and start Choose Your Words. We'll have a bio break in a bit, not too long, but just trying to give everyone hope. So I'm not sure we want this right now. Maybe a little later. We're going to be going over some of the words, some of the word choices, Now, it's often helpful as you're looking at material, when you're reviewing material, to first say, is this structured properly? Is there something that needs to be, often what I find when people say in conclusion, sometimes that can be moved to the beginning. So you're looking at big chunks of things, and then you make your focus narrower and narrower. Like, are the headers throughout? Are they clear? Do they make sense to people? Is there anything that should be a list or a table? And then you start working on sentences and paragraphs. Can you break those up? Can you move those around? And then you start looking at word choices and fine tuning. I should also say, because I sometimes forget to say this, that it's important to not do everything at once. I mean, it's really hard when you've been working with a piece for a long time. It's really hard to keep track of things. And when I'm going through, sometimes I can like make a note to myself, like maybe this should be a table, but I don't work on the table right then because I'm looking at something else, or I'm reading for flow, or I'm checking the headers. But you don't have to do everything at one time. It's easier, for example, as we'll learn, to go over passive voice if you're just looking for passive voice throughout the document. So, there's some different ways to do that. So these are the things that we're going to be going over next. And one of the things that is also good is choosing shorter words. Now, I do find that some people have fallen victim to government writing and have, fallen into these habits. And it's really interesting working with people, who have been using government jargon or government language for a long time and say, we're reaching a non-government audience. Let's make it easier. Let's use words that, other people use. And some of these are really straightforward, like commence. Nobody says commence in real life. It's begin or start, or attempt, try. Implement, I hate that one myself. Utilize, generally use, although I have an anecdote about that. Submit, send, or give. There's generally options for here, and it's not that these are bad words because they are long, but they are throwing up roadblocks to people who are trying to get through the sentence. Can you smooth out a sentence? Can you, ease your reader through it? For example, some people might say, I'm going to have to terminate the contract. Well, you can say that if you're dealing to acquisition professionals who, poor things, have to read that all the time. But you can also say, I have to stop your contract, or I have to end it. You really think, is this a term of art or an industry jargon that I absolutely have to use? Or can I use like real people language? So we're going to have a poll this time. And I hope we can have it again. If your most hated word is not on this list, just add it to the chat. Gabby, can we see that again? Thank you so much. Yeah. I'm going to mention when I was, a number of years ago, when I was teaching at Quantico, I had one of my students talk about utilize, and he said that he knew the difference between user and utilize, and I thought, great, somebody needs to say this. So he said, and you're missing the visual, I'm so sorry, but he said, if I take this pencil and I use it to write with, I'm using it because it's specifically designed as a writing instrument. You're supposed to write with a pencil. And I was like, okay, yes, I accept that. That completely works. He said, but if I poke your eye out with it, I'm utilizing it because it's not specifically designed to poke out people's eyes. So, you know, use and utilize do not actually mean the same thing. So, okay. Wow, very interesting. I wonder what the red one's going to be. Terminate, a lot of hatred for terminate. Yeah. Interesting. Big results here. Yeah. Thank you, Gabby. So another point is, what is jargon? And you know, jargon is every industry, every job field, every group has its insider lingo. You know, it's we know we are in this special group, and we know that we're part of the special group because we're the only ones who know what these words mean. And it's one of the ways you bond, I guess, I don't know. And obviously groups do that as a way of communicating quickly, as a way of making things happen faster. Unfortunately, what happens is you exclude others, and you may or may not mean to do that. But, you know, for example, if you're using certain acronyms, you know, when I was on a plain language detail, I was learning about plain language, I was doing certain things, and I started with a briefing to my new team. And one of the examples I used had a lot of examples from the IT GWACs. And so I was saying GWACs here and GWACs here and GWACs practically, you know, on the entire presentation. And completely unsurprisingly, their first question was, what's a GWAC? You know, and I was hoping that they would have questions about plain language, but their question was really obvious, and I should have known better. And, you know, it was just one of those things that a GWAC is a government-wide acquisition contract. But since this team wasn't in acquisition, there's no way they would know that. And what they would think about is, I still don't know what a GWAC is. I wonder what a GWAC is. Instead of thinking, oh yes, I see how these plain language edits are superb or whatever. You know, they were stuck on things. And this is a way of not letting your audience get stuck on things, which is what we want. Sometimes acronyms will do that. And that is the same kind of thing, that it will confuse or throw people off the track if they're not part of the group that understands this. A quick example of this is I was working with a group on my former team, I think it was maybe 2 summers ago. And they said, you know, we want to add some web pages. And I said, hurrah, that's always good. You know, thanks for sending it on. And I noticed that one of the things they had included was DHS. And I looked at it, and they had dispatch handling service, DHS. And I went back to them and I said, you know, I think that the Department of Homeland Security has that one locked down. You know, DHS, Department of Homeland Security, government, you know, they win at that. And they looked at me and they said, we've been working for this for 6 months and we never noticed that. So an important part of plain language review is actually being the person not in the group where you say, you know, this part doesn't make sense. Because, you know, people when they work together on different, you know, projects, but they learn, you know, people on teams learn shortcuts, or they're all like, oh yeah, that meeting we had with Bill, you know, we got that whole thing on, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. But they don't think about how it comes to others. Like, as I said, some of the plain language review that I've been doing recently has been on topics I had no idea about. Things on like web analytics. You know, I have some very remedial ideas about them, but, you know, I'm not doing it every day. Artificial intelligence. I have a vague notion, but, you know, so it's actually important, I think, not to be an expert in a topic that you're, you know, working on, because it enables you to see, okay, that, I don't see how you moved from this to that, or this sentence doesn't make any sense to me, or I don't understand this phrase, or what does this stand for? You know, what does this acronym stand for? Because I don't know. And that is actually very useful, because people generally want, you know, if you get something for review or to do an edit on, they want to have the problems pointed out so they can fix them, not to have them slip by. And then when it gets published, people are like, oh, you know, that page 17, that made no sense to me. Was that supposed to be like that? So sometimes I was talking about metaphors a little while ago, um, with some friends, and I said, with plain language editing, I often feel that I'm running around with a safety net, trying to keep people from, you know, confusing their audience. So no more blah blah. Make your point without jargon. It'll also allow your content to live longer, because sometimes jargon falls out of favor and people don't use it anymore. So uh, I think I'll just, well, why don't we have our bio break? We'll come back in 5 minutes, get some tea or whatever, and you can drive yourself nuts looking at one agency's acronyms list. So I'll be back in about 5 minutes. Okay, I think that was 5 minutes. I'm not 100% sure. I'm dealing with a few things right now, but meaning I had 2 different clocks. Alex, do people seem to be back?
Looks like we still have 575 folks, so I think we're good to keep moving.
Okay, thank you so much for checking, and thank you, Gabby, for doing such a great job with the polls.
No problem,
Oh,
Catherine. And I think you are like exactly 5 minutes.
oh, that's wonderful. I love
Perfect
that.
timing.
That's always exciting when I manage to pull that off. Sometimes it turns into 7 or I start, starting the dishwasher or something, but thank you so much. Okay, this is one agency's acronyms list. Please don't do this. This is just depressing. If you have to use this many acronyms, maybe you need an intervention. Maybe you need a plain language intervention, which is, just a sort of thought here. But it's interesting, though, that acronyms are not necessarily consistent across the federal government. And, as I said before when I had the DHS example, try not to invent your own unless you have to. just a warning. They tend to put people off. They tend to make people feel, oh, they're talking governmentese, which they are, of course. So a little bit more on avoiding acronyms, if you can. It presumes your audience knows them. And they may not. If they do not, their, so to speak, train of thought is going to be going down a different direction from yours, from what you intended, what you wanted. And if they don't know them, they'll either stop reading or they'll guess. And again, that takes them away from the path you wanted them to follow. Now, if you can guarantee your audience will know certain terms, like, for example, again, when I was on an acquisition team, yeah, there were certain things we could pretty much guarantee that the audience would know. RFQ, RFP, CO, COTR, COTAR, CO, a couple of different things. Like, yeah, if you're in the field, and we did a fair amount of looking at position descriptions. We said, can you give us some sample position descriptions for hiring acquisition professionals at GSA? And, what they looked for was mostly, it wasn't going to be people coming completely new to it, and there were certain training courses. So, we were trying to gauge, how much how much acquisition jargon and acronyms can we include fairly? Because, we also don't want to be obvious. We don't want to explain things that everyone reading those pages would know. And we could more or less guarantee that people were not going there for fun. There are certain agencies that people might go to for fun or to see good pictures, but GSA acquisition pages are not one of that group. So it's also useful to think, how much, one of the issues we know we're facing, to sort of counterbalance that argument, we know that we're dealing with a lot of retiring acquisition personnel. A lot of acquisition people are retiring. And so to counterbalance that, we have a lot of new people coming in. So, maybe being a little bit more careful about the jargon and the acronyms would help, and clarifying things and putting it in better order. Because, if you have an experienced person reading something, they can fill in the blanks a little bit. It's mean to do that, but they can do that. Doing that with a new person is not good. That's just not going to work. So some advice on acronyms and initialisms, and I can never quite remember, it's whether you can pronounce them as a word or not, or if people only remember the initials together, like scuba and radar and things. But at any rate, don't use them if you're only using them infrequently, you know, throughout whatever your thing is. Don't invent new ones that really, I mean, don't invent new ones without explaining them to the reader. That's where you really do have to spell them out. Don't let one acronym mean more than one thing. You'd think that would be pretty straightforward. But, you know, if, getting back to the first one, don't use them for infrequent phrases. You can use it, but explain it, you know, spell it out. Whether you do spell it out and then the acronym or initialism in parentheses or the opposite way, you know, just, you don't want people sitting there wondering what it is. You know, however you make that clear to anyone, that will work. It's also important to try other styles. You can, you know, give a generic noun, the council, the agency, the office, the department, the program. You can use, if you're talking about the program, you can say it. If you're talking about an office or your, you know, your agency, you can say we. If you must invent acronyms, try and make them pronounceable. They're a lot easier. And again, if you haven't used it for a while, like you used it on page 2 and then you use it again on page 80, redefine it. People are not remembering what you're doing. So, you know, this is also sort of moving into how to use pronouns, you know, for to reduce or repeat, to keep from repeating the same word over and over and over again. But I'll tell you, it will get very tiresome if all of your sentences are things like, ITC offers many options for buying and selling technology, ITC. I mean, it turns into the Peanuts cartoon, you know, where the teachers are always because, you know, it's the visual equivalent of that sound. So, you know, see how you can smooth it out, see how you can use different connectors. And using we is perfectly grammatical. It's a big shift for some agencies, but, you know, literally, you know, it's, we are presenting this idea. You know, we are explaining this to you. We are offering jobs. We have opportunities, all of these things. So, as I started to say, pronouns are words that replace nouns in sentences or phrases. So they have a couple of other advantages. They speak directly to readers. This is, you might often see this mostly when you have instructions, you know, because in that, instead of saying you must do these things, you must fill it out, you must send it, you must whatever. You can use what's called this, the imperative or command voice. That's the fill this out, send it to us, wait for a reply card or, you know, whatever. It's when you're issuing orders, sit, stand, you know, stay, you know, if you think about, but you're making it clear to people what they need to do. So pronouns will allow you to speak directly to readers and sort of show who's responsible for what. This is important. They make your writing more relevant because people are always thinking, if they're not thinking, why do I have to read this? They're thinking, what's in it for me? You know, what am I trying to do here? It will also help eliminate extra words. It will help you tighten your sentences. Now, I know that tight sentences and paragraphs are not, you know, the perfect solution for plain language, but it's one of the things that I see a great deal in government writing. There's a lot of prepositional phrases. There's a lot of longer sentences, and you know, they're sort of writing past their own point. So when I'm editing, I tighten that. Pronouns will also keep you, as we talked a little bit ago, keep you from repeating the same words over and over. The office, the division, the agency, it's a lot more fun to just say we, or, you know, our efforts, or our communication attempts, or, you know, whatever. You know, it's just tedious to keep seeing the same words over and over. Another thing, and this is a big surprise to some people, but you can use contractions and possessives. And that's when you combine nouns and verbs, usually with an apostrophe. So this is something we do a lot speaking, and it's literally elision. You're moving words together, and it makes for easier reading as well. We do not generally say in conversation, yes, I will be happy to go with you to the shop of the coffee. We just don't. It's like, sure, I'll be right along. I'll meet you at the coffee shop. And that's one element of that, keeping the subject and verb together and tightening things. And also, and I'm speaking as a person who's very recently seen a lot of prepositional phrase problems. Not problems, it just seemed to make the sentence much longer than it needed to be. You can also combine that. If you say a long prepositional phrase like customer journey of the agency, okay, that is perfectly grammatically correct. Is that the best choice? Maybe not. How do we make that tighter? We make it the agency's customer journey. Same meaning, tighter connection, slightly shorter. You're not asking your reader to remember, the agency part showing ownership. You're making that obvious in a different way. So, this is another element. Now the fun part, I always think, maybe not. This is where we talk about active and passive voice. Now, I am sometimes surprised, simply because of my background, my experience, that people don't know what passive voice is. But, not everyone, became a editor. Not everyone went down that same path. So what I try to do is to show, passive voice is grammatically correct, and surprisingly, it is often the better choice. But there's also active voice. And again, in this whole bunch of reviews that I've done in the last month, there was a lot of passive voice. I was like, okay, who's doing what? I mean, and it was my job to do that, but when you get it to the reader, you do not actually want them wondering who's doing what. You want that to be clear. So let's explore active and passive voice. This is a little bit of grammar that I think will clarify a lot. I apologize, at least it's not a fire alarm. It's another kind of alarm, but it's in a vehicle. Okay. I live right off of Route 1 in Virginia, and there's a lot of interesting traffic noises from that. Okay. Active voice is what we do the most of. Somebody does something. Subject, verb, maybe an object equals a sentence. And literally, that means I, the subject, am going, that's the verb, to the store. I'm going to the store. Who's doing the action? I am. Who or what is receiving the action? The store. Just to make this a little complicated, let's look at the passive voice construction. In passive voice, the person or item acted upon. So the store was visited by me. Both ways are grammatical. One is slightly easier to understand. I mean, much easier to understand. Don't fall into the trap of thinking passive voice is better. It has very specific uses, as we will look at. So, a slightly more interesting example. The topic was discussed by them. Who did the acting? What's the verb? Discuss. Who did the discussing? They. they discuss the topic. So these are the same. One of them is easier. English does favor the active voice. This is something that other languages do not necessarily do. It's always interesting to hang around with some other plain language people because you learn little tidbits from other languages. But just as an example, apparently, as I understand it, in Spanish, the pencil forgets itself. You know, nobody actually forgets it. The pencil is responsible, which I am really glad to know for all of my possessions that keep losing themselves. You know, it's all their fault. So this is the sort of thing you have to look at for the examples. Another way, and this became much more popular, can you spot by zombies? For example, if you have the store was entered, if you add by zombies, who entered the store? Zombies. So that makes it, you know, if you just say the store was entered, who did the entering? Somebody has to do something. You don't have a complete sentence if you can add by zombies. Who entered the store? Zombies. Zombies entered the store is the active voice version of this. Although I do not recommend, if you're doing track changes as you're editing, I do not recommend writing zombies question mark in your comments. I'm just saying that it's not likely to go over well. So how do you fix? How do you fix? Well, first you look at the sentence and say, what does it need? And if you have something like the talking points were drafted by them, there's no point. You know, you switch it to active. They drafted the talking points. So do you see how we're moving from passive to active? It's shifting the emphasis. It's making explicit who is doing what. So as I've said, passive voice is grammatically correct. And sometimes, not quite as often as many people think, but sometimes you want to emphasize who or what received the action. So the city was bombed. You may not know who did it, you know, by whom. Maybe you can't answer that. The idea was not encouraged. Maybe you do know, but you don't want to say. You know, sometimes these things come up. Some other points when plain language works. Your car has been stolen. You don't know by whom. There would be less point in saying car thieves stole my car. You know, that is active voice, but what you want to emphasize is my car was stolen, you know, because that's the important part, not car thieves. Presidents are elected every 4 years. The doer is obvious. You know, you don't necessarily want to say the United States elects presidents every 4 years. Maybe you want the emphasis to be on president. Her outfit was covered with glitter. The doer doesn't matter. I mean, you've got glitter. Annual leave has been canceled. The doer is best left unnamed. This is where tact and discretion come into plain language. And instead of, you should have done that report by now, the report should have been done by whatever, avoids a direct attack. So these are some subtle points about when plain language is appropriate and the best choice. You know, but usually I would say 95% of the time what you want is active voice. And when you use it, do it on purpose. Just don't fall into writing in passive voice. That puts a huge burden on the audience, on your audience, to figure out who's doing what. Is this something I'm supposed to do? Is this something you're supposed to do? Well, maybe I should do it, you know, if it's not clear. So here's another thing of rescuing hidden verbs. And we see this a lot. We see this a lot with, it's sort of allied to the longer words, choosing shorter words that we saw earlier. But what it also does is verbs have been turned into nouns, and part of, you know, your job as a plain language practitioner is to pull out the verbs, because verbs carry a lot of the weight in an English sentence. And if you get the verb right, then you know who's doing it, you know, whoever's doing the word. And always, if you're turning a verb into a noun, as has happened here, you need a lot of extra words. You know, conduct an analysis of. Well, you can rescue that to just be analyze. Provide assistance to. This drives me bonkers. You can replace that with assist, help, aid, whatever. You know, but this is puffiness when you don't necessarily need puffiness. This is not softening the verb, it's just hiding it. You know, you don't need four words when you have one. And I was thinking about, when I gave this class last month, I was thinking about some of the issues that I have hit before with coming up with some of these words. I was on a conference call with a boss of mine, and this boss really came to the conclusion. And one day she had given me something to review, and I changed came to the conclusion to concluded. And, you know, she said, where did you get concluded? And I explained verbs and noun formations and adding ION and all of that. So at any rate, we were on this call where someone said, I will conversate with you later. Now, of course, I almost fell out of my chair, but my boss emailed me and was chatting with me, and she said, conversate? And I looked at it and I was thinking, well, yeah, from converse, but we already have speak, talk, or say. So, you know, why do we have conversate? I mean, we wouldn't necessarily say converse. We have other English words that take care of that. And I found in some, just, reading the paper, I found two more created words like that, like conversated. One was coronated. It was a piece about Queen Elizabeth II, and they said, she was coronated in 1953. And I stopped reading completely at that point because I was like, wait a minute, wait. Crowned. We've already got crowned. Why coronated? I can kind of see where, coronated came from coronation, but really? We need that? And in another one, someone used the verb wardrobed. And again, it was like, why wardrobed? Shut in a box? I mean, that's literally what I thought of first, but, dressed would be fine. So, people make up words, I'm speaking very generally here, but people make up words like this and they only confuse other people. You're like, what? What does this mean? Why is this a word? We already have a word for that. Do we need extra ones? So this is one way of making it easier for your reader, making it plainer, making it easier, not making your reader do a great deal of work to understand, which is, all to the good. So a couple of general advice about words to sentences. Cut out redundancies and cliches. I don't know, I've been thinking about it, but the one I'm hating right now is in these uncertain times. Like, oh, I'm just tired of it. It makes it even less certain. See how you can reduce clauses to phrases, phrases to words. You can, instead of a adverb phrase, you can just use an adverb. You can do a lot of tightening at the sentence level. Leave out unnecessary words. That's going to be your call about how to get out that. And be obvious. People say things like, we must all work together in these uncertain times. And I sit there wondering, what do you want me to do? I mean, that is so vague. It means everything. It means nothing. So these are things to beware of. Pay attention to your word order. How are you emphasizing? What are you emphasizing in your sentences? Is that what you want to emphasize? So some ideas on that. And sentences to paragraphs. Now this is, again, getting back to the sort of design element we were talking about earlier when we looked at bullets and headers and lists. But I've seen too many honking long paragraphs, you know, to look upon them with an eye of favor. I mean, it's just like, ow, you know, I feel like I'm being hit over the head with all of these words at once. So, you know, give me some breathing space, you know, begin your new paragraph. It's okay to have short paragraphs. Sometimes a paragraph can be a transition between ideas and you just need a sentence or something, but it needs to be on its own. This is again a question of emphasis. When you introduce a new idea, when you're contrasting, give people some space to understand what you're doing. If you want to give your reader a break, if you look at your paragraph and it's 2 pages long, break it up. You know, also see if any of your paragraphs can just be a list. I mean, a list will not solve everything, it's true, but it will help clarify some things. And when you're ending your introduction, start a new paragraph. If you're starting your conclusion, make that a new paragraph. Make it really obvious where people are going. And add some of the transition words. That's a huge help too. Sometimes, and this is sort of part of this, sometimes you just have to sort of stop reading, look at the page and say, oh, we've got 2-3 paragraphs that are kind of short, and then at the end we've got, you know, 2 paragraphs that are, you know, a good size, but we've this one in the middle is 40 lines long. I mean, sometimes you have to literally step back and look at, you know, how does it look rather than how does it read? So those, I think, help indicate to your reader, this is a new idea or this is a supporting idea, but it's not going to be all that long. So this is something from an executive order. Now let's just look at it for a moment. Ow. Now there's some things they could have done. We've got 2 series of numbered lists. You know, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So something that says to me is take advantage of that. Take advantage of the formatting. So at least one thing we could do is we add a new line. That immediately improves how readable it is. One of the things, just to go back for a second, again, sorry if I'm making anyone seasick. This phrase here, with the regard to the review required by blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's a new topic. We've got our points 1, 2, 3, and this is a new topic, so it gets a new line. You know, I ran out of space, but for the first paragraph, this too improves it hugely. You know, respect to the review, these 3 things, sorry. So that is just some ways that adding spaces help. But, you know, remember the reader-centered organization? What does your reader need? This is what your reader needs. This rule meets the requirements found in sections 3A and 3B2 of Executive Order 12988. They don't need this. They don't need it even made better and more readable. Sometimes you have to look at the whole thing and say, what do they need? So, you know, this is, I think, sometimes, you know, the most important point is not what you think they have even after plain language, but what do they require? That's what they need. They need the sentence. They don't need that whole page. So another rewrite for emphasis. This was from my former team. And before I even look at the words, I've got some long ones here. I've got structuring, I've got acquisition, I've got realization, I've got transition, and it's starting to sound a little peanutsy, wonk, 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 because what it actually, what the reader actually wanted to know, and I'm even less sure about this phrase here, but everything that was available under satellite services will also be included in SATCOM 2. So one of the things also that I feel I should, explain is I've often done plain language reviews and then gotten them back a month or so later, and people have said, can you look at this part? And, I say, sure, I'm happy to. And then I see other things. I'm like, how did I miss that? So plain language reviews, they're always a good idea. They're always important. You can't guarantee that you will catch everything all the time. I have gone back and seen things and I don't believe I missed that point. Or, oh, shoot, I wish I'd thought of this before. This really needs to be up higher on the page. So you do what you can. You hope to revisit things. You hope to catch everything. But, sometimes it doesn't work completely the way we want. So again, there's questions of being obvious. This is what journalists often call the lead, and it may or may not apply to what you are doing or the writing that you're being asked to do. But consider, making things obvious. Here, there's two competing leads. There's NASA's proposing another space project. The budget requests $10 billion. If it were me, I'm just saying, I would be putting the 10 billion up here, but obviously they wanted to make this an inductive point. And inductive is when you explain things and then the conclusion, they reach, people are like, oh yeah, I see how they got the request for 10 billion for all of these things. If you remember Sherlock Holmes, he did it the other way. He did point. I'm sorry, he did conclusion because of this, and that, the deductive logic. It's an interesting parallel, if you're looking for agreement up front or not. There's nothing wrong with being obvious. Again, this is another rewrite, but it's looking for how can you convey what you want to convey. Now, obviously, people who support the space program would be more inclined to a softer approach than people who say, oh, why are we giving them 10 billion? But, there's always that sort of thing in play. So, you've considered your audience, you've organized, you've written your content, or you've edited. It's really helpful to step back and ask yourself, can I do this in a better way? And they're kind of plain language, but this is where you say, do I need a chart? Do I need a visual graph? Do I need something that makes the point easier than a description? Sometimes there are better choices. There are things you have to think of to do that. People read slower on the web, and as I said, they scan, and as we've seen, people are doing that offline as well. It's important to make your information count. Obviously, the fewer words, the more they will see if they're scanning. Just the law of averages for that. But cutting your content, shortening sentences and paragraphs is not the only goal, and it's not a goal in itself. Clarity is the goal. Your reader understanding is the goal. Look to be clear, even if you end up adding words, because what you want is that people understand. You don't want them just scanning the content and clicking a box. You want them to know what you've tried to explain. So it's important to know just cutting things isn't going to cut it, as it were. And this is a Nielsen-Norman group usability eye tracking test. And this shows what people focus on. You know, people go across and they look at sentences and they look at lists and then they see buttons down here. You know, it's just interesting. I don't know if you're, if you're involved in web writing, you might ask your web team if they have access to heat mapping software. I think Crazy Egg, we used to use that. You know, what are people focusing on is always a useful thing. There's some things to guide that, like as I said, the bulleted list, the headers, people will look at that, but it's important to get real data and see, where people are going on your pages if that is your job. It's harder to do that if you're dealing with paper, but there are some ways to do that. Self-editing steps, as I said, take a break. Choose your method of however you edit. Are you doing track changes? Are you doing paper? Are you doing online? It's important to be able to concentrate. I'm finding it much easier to concentrate at home than in the office, but that's when I'm not having fire alarms running all the time. It's also important to take your time. I've had people who say, can you look at this, 80-page document by tomorrow morning? And the answer is no. You're giving it to me at, 5 o'clock. No, I cannot. I cannot do that by tomorrow. And, you have to be honest with yourself and your colleagues about that. You have to be able to take your time. Now, one of the things I am doing is trying to come up with a plain language process and a review negotiation. Like people say, will you review this? And I'm like, well, I'll review it for plain language, but I can't guarantee that it will be voice and tone. That's not necessarily things I'm looking for. I will note them, but I'm not necessarily looking for brand, voice, and tone with that. And it's important, I think, that people know I can do this, I can't do that. Like, I can't approve the financial information that you've listed. Like, no, you have to go somewhere else for that. But it's making sure that what you've agreed to is what they've agreed to as well. You want to check also for flow. Are they repeating themselves? Is it clear? Is what they're proposing or discussing clear? Is the logic sound? And I'm not a logician, but sometimes I've had to ask, this does not flow from that. I do not see how you got this conclusion from your preceding paragraphs. It's helpful also to share with other people to say, this sentence, this paragraph, this phrase, this acronym is really bothering me. Is this standard for this group? And something I was just doing, as I said, the reviews, I realized that they have a lot of prepositional phrases. That's where I got the agency's customer journey instead of the customer journey of the agency. I was seeing a lot of that long prepositional phrases. And I was thinking, is there a way to put that in like the review agreement? But I'm still working on that. I'm still negotiating, what it is that people want me to look for. And at what stage, do I do I review it before or after legal? It's a couple of different things. I usually prefer to see it earlier, but then you always risk people making it less plain. So reviewing edits for patterns is useful because you can say, I'm seeing a lot of passive voice, and you explain what passive voice is and you explain what you are doing to fix it, or you point out the prepositional phrases and how they are making their sentences longer when there's a fix. or you add that you're adding pronouns or, verbs or something, or breaking up long paragraphs, just, so, again, that is a work in progress, because I think we're always doing that, but just trying to get to, let's see how this goes this way. It's useful to say, as you're wrapping up a project, I really saw a lot of passive voice, or I really saw a lot of long paragraphs, or I tried to add some headers to make things flow better, so people know why you added stuff. I think sometimes a plain language review is proofreading, and I can't turn that off, because I used to work on a magazine, but plain language is not proofreading. That's really a separate step. So, question for you: do you feel comfortable starting or continuing to edit for plain language? And that's a poll, Gabby. I think the last one. And if you don't feel comfortable, editing or continuing to edit, what's standing in your way? And you can just add that in the chat if you like, or if you have a suggestion on further training or workshops. Oh, yay. Great. That's very encouraging. Let me wish you all success in your efforts. I appreciate that a lot. I think it's time for another bio break, and then we'll come back and we'll do some exercises. So I want to keep sharing, but I don't want to share that. I think I'll just come back and move to the Word document, and we'll do some live editing. So maybe 5 more minutes. I have 2:48. That may actually be incorrect. 55. So we'll come back at 3 o'clock. Great. Thanks again. See you in 5 minutes. And we're back. I'm going to try this whole thing. Okay. Always a brief feeling of complete dismay when I move from slides to documents. Alex, are we all mostly back by now, or?
I think you're
Looks
good
like
to
it.
go.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, this is the point where we do some of the exercises we would have done in an in-person class. So I think we sent this out earlier so you could have a chance to work on it on your own, but we'll see about how to handle questions on this. So this might get a little messy, but I'll hope not. So one of the exercises we have is on nouns and pronouns. And sometimes you have to explain a little bit, to people who may not have had a grammar class in a long time. Yeah, it would be also helpful if this did not mess up. Okay, sorry, grumbling at words auto stuff. So, okay, copies of tax returns must be provided. Now, must be provided is a clue. It's in passive voice, so some of this may be a guess, but we'll give it. And again, we get some of these out of context, and sometimes when you get more context, things make more sense. But these are just samples from different agencies for plain language classes. So the first one, this is going to be a multiple edit thing. First one I'm looking at is must be provided copies of tax returns. You must provide copies of, and this is, whenever you add pronouns, you often have to read through the entire sentence to make sure that, there's nothing else that you need to add or change, like a possessive pronoun. Like, you must provide copies of your tax returns. And what I might also try and do is make that command voice instead of you must. I mean, that's fine. That clarifies who has to do what. I also might make that typo, can't type anymore. Provide copies of your tax returns. And this answer, again, would depend on context. But what we're looking to do is, how can you get pronouns out of this? And if for some reason it's not you, that you is not the subject, it would have to be they must provide copies of their tax returns. But you have to make some assumption about the answer, how you would add a pronoun. Now this is, I'm mentally and quietly yelling at Word, but I'm not doing it out loud. Okay. So the next thing is the one about loan applications. And think about this.
Hey,
This
Catherine,
yeah.
I think that if you could toggle the slides and get into presentation mode.
These aren't slides. This is just a Word document.
Okay.
What do you mean by toggling?
We're just looking in the chat here to make sure that you're presenting the correct thing. I think that
I had screen sharing. What are you seeing?
we see the use plain language when you write with, we see the last slide of your PowerPoint.
Oh, would it be easier to just exit out of that to close that? Oh, I'm apparently not sharing the window.
Right, and then
So,
if you
I definitely don't want that.
if you pull up the Word window.
Right. Okay.
Perfect.
Great. Thanks for stopping me. You know, otherwise it would have been me talking and people shrugging their shoulders and saying, I don't know, maybe she's right. Okay. Now that we can see it a little bit better, the copies of tax returns must be provided. I went with you must provide and then changed that to understood you, where, you know, if you're using a command, you do not actually use the pronoun. It's like the sit, stay commands. So that is that. And one of the things I said is one of the things you need to do if you're changing pronouns is you have to read the entire sentence and make sure you don't have anything sort of left over. You have to go back and change that. And this is actually an excellent point because number 2 is very similar to that. Loan applications will be reviewed to ensure that procedures have been followed. Now, that is both elements of that are in passive voice, and you have to look at the logic of it. I have sometimes had to write down, you know, to people, you know, in plain language reviews and said, this is a logic problem. You know, you are telling them about something, how do they know about it? You know, you have to think through, this is that curse of knowledge I told you about. So this in itself is a logic problem, who's doing what? So this is my best guess here. We will review your loan application to ensure you have followed procedures. You know, and this is just thinking, you know, judging from the language, it's sent by like a company maybe, or, you know, an agency, and they will be the ones reviewing, and somebody else has to follow procedures. You know, it's not just straightforward edits. You really do have to look at the logic of things sometimes. Okay, this is another one, and this is about nouns and pronouns. And so instead of the applicant, let's make that you. You will be the primary source of information regarding, this is not a pronoun part, but I would change that to about your. And again, if I made that pronoun you, I have to make this your circumstances. And this is another tightening. This is a hidden verb. We've got for the purposes of determining, and I'm just going to make that to determine your eligibility and need. You know, and that is just trying to make things a little bit more straightforward for people who are receiving. You know, because if you don't know, if it's in passive voice, that means that and unnamed subjects, you can really have some confusion. You know, you can really confuse your reader. So, okay, this is another one. I'm going to do a couple of things. To establish, this is what I was talking about a little bit before about prepositional phrases. And I'm going to probably use you throughout, so I'm going to make that, I might start with to establish voucher eligibility, you, and then I'm going to say, okay, I've got to go back to establish your voucher eligibility. You must show that you have a low income and that your present housing is substandard and inadequate. Can we call this performance art if I'm typing it, everyone? Just an idea. Give me 1 second. I'll be right back. So are there any questions in the chat about any of these substitutions or the edits that I made here? Is everyone following along? Alex or Gabby, are there any questions in the chat?
Hi, Catherine. Yes,
Okay.
there are. So it looks like Brindisi, would it be too redundant to use to determine eligibility and need in both lines?
I am a little lost. Are we talking about number 3?
No, sorry.
No. Okay.
Nope. Nope. It says, nope. Never mind. It's good.
Okay.
I think there was some. They're a little bit ahead. Sorry.
Oh, well, that does happen. People reading ahead, you know,
Right.
that's I always did it, so I'm immediately sympathetic.
Okay.
One thing I did want to point out is, and this just is something we talked about earlier, and this exercise is not about parallelism, but I did that anyway. You must show 2 things: that you have a low income and that your present housing is substandard and inadequate. So you have both phrases being introduced by that, and that these are equally important. These are the 2 things. So, I mean, I don't think I'd make that edit as a question of understanding the edit. You know, I might do that just to make sure. I have done that before. I've copied and pasted something and tested it out in Notepad or Word just to say, okay, is the sentence, before I start editing it, is it actually what I think it is? So, okay, reasonably painless. Pronouns in active voice, which is a little bit like what we did just now. I'm seeing if I can give myself a little bit more room. Let me see. Okay, we have 2 things here. Assume that this is from the agency. That's my working assumption. We have developed consumer messages to educate the public about the key recommendations in the dietary guidelines. Okay, I'm stopping that sentence because it went on too long. We will use them in, I may be going a little far here, consumer targeted materials separate from this publication. Okay, I'm going to stop because a couple of things. I would, if I were doing this for publication, I mean, if I were reviewing this for someone, I would query this. And I'm just going to do this separately. And I would say, well, it would always help if I could find the comment part. Dang. So embarrassing to have my word deficiencies exposed. I will ask, does the audience need to know that? Because, you know, this is, again, I don't have context, I'm making certain assumptions, but we've developed consumer messages to educate the public about the key recommendations and the dietary guidelines. We will use them in consumer targeted materials. I would stop it here. Yeah, I mean, again, I'm making some calls, but that's why you have queries, because, you know, does the audience need to know that they would be separate consumer targeted materials, or perhaps we will use them in separate or other. Ugh, I'm not entirely sure that gets it much better. Maybe. So, I would definitely query this because I don't see how that's useful, but it would depend. If it was an internal report, that might make more sense. Dang it, formatting crap. One of the issues that I hit a lot is this particular construction. It is, there is, there are, here is, here are, it was, things like that. Where? My question here is where. Recently, X reported that, and I'm going to go out on a limb here and I'm going to say, I would say that it's the agency making this this report. Now, this is also a little difficult. We've got, instead of it was reported, we've got this active. Dietary patterns that followed, and I might not get away with that. This is where I might put people in, foreground people in that. Individuals age 45 years and older in the United States who followed I'd look at this. This might be wrong, but this is what I'm getting from this. We reported that individuals aged 45 years and older in the United States who followed recommended dietary guidance had a lower risk of mortality. This is one of those things that I would query because I'm not positive about this. But I think that what threw me off first was it was reported. That's something where we need context. And what's the difference between dietary patterns and dietary guidance? So that's unsatisfactory. Were there any questions on these? Either of these? Well, we'll move on to sentences and paragraphs, and let's see if I can be a little more sensible about this.
Catherine, really quick, there were just
Sure.
a couple things about, can you use the reported word? We don't know who reported.
Right. Yeah. That was completely an assumption that I made.
Okay.
I mean, because generally Plain gets these exercises from federal government agencies, and where would we get this report from? But that again, I mean, sometimes you can make plain language edits and there's no arguing about them, but sometimes you have to ask, is this what this sentence means? And sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes it's no. How did you get that? And you're like, well, this, that, and this I found particularly confusing. And it might be easier if we said individuals age 45 whose dietary patterns followed recommended dietary guidance, had a lower risk of mortality. But I wouldn't keep that. I mean, that needs some more work, but I need to understand it first. Was there another question?
Okay, so There was one question about the communication messages from Diane. I just need to scroll up and grab.
Okay.
Hold on.
Well, I'm sure that transcript is huge. So.
Yeah, I'm just starting to. Okay. Okay. The question is, shouldn't you say we will use messages because one could assume that you may be using the recommendations?
I think it's two different things. There are key recommendations from the dietary guidelines, and they've produced consumer messages to teach the public about those key recommendations. You know, again, these are exercise questions for a reason. I did have a very minor point that I missed, which is depending on your agency and how open they are, this is one of those connecting things. We've developed consumer messages. Yeah.
Here's one, Catherine.
Mm-hmm.
I know that you should never end a sentence with a preposition phrase. When is it inappropriate to begin a sentence with a preposition?
Actually, you can do both. English is mostly a lot of English expressions involve prepositional phrases. So it's not actually an issue, it's how it's being used. Generally, it's I think they're adverbial. Sometimes they're modifying something. It depends on, this is why it's really helpful to have an example in front of me, but let me see if I can add something here. Under previous leadership, I'm just changing this. Under previous leadership, now that's a prepositional phrase. You could also make that we developed consumer messages to educate the public, you know, from the previous leaders. Yeah, these are not great examples, I'm so sorry, but you can do that. Prepositional phrases are not a problem. There's also verbs that have a lot of prepositions in them, and it's kind of embarrassing that the only one I can think of is to put up with. But I mean, you have to have all of those pieces to make the verb make sense. Yeah, I'm so sorry. If you come up with an example that you can share with me later on, if you could send it to me, I'd appreciate it so much. But I wanted to repeat that it is okay to end a sentence with a preposition or prepositional phrase. I mean, sometimes you just have to do that as long as it's not incomplete. Moving to, what is this? Sentences and paragraphs. This is, okay. Drat. I did not mean to do that. Okay. No. Well, I can see that this is not going to be my day for copying and pasting, but I think it'll make it a little easier finally. Okay. So looking at this is huge. You know, this initiative works to educate specific underserved communities, to recognize and report, blah, 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 blah. So, I mean, that's a really long sentence. Now, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking parallelism. These things, that's parallel, this is parallel. And this is parallel. So what do we do with all of these things? Magical bulleted list. Recognize and report. To assist in, and the pattern we're looking here for, well, pattern we're looking for here is to plus a verb. To recognize and report, to assist, and to advocate. Now, that makes it a little easier. I only bolded it to show, the pattern, and you might look at the sentence up here, the initiative works to educate, and think, oh, we've missed one. But this is not one of those. I mean, it does have the same pattern, but these are the three things that they're educating. This is why you have to sort of read the whole thing and not just look for a pattern. Does it make sense? These are the three elements that make up the educating. And this is a logic question. One of the things, there's a cue hidden in this that really is necessary to be able to do it. Although I have to say that I feel that this is a very old example. And what I'm looking at is this part. This is why you have to read everything before you start editing, because I have been led astray. But that's a logic issue. Let's start this. And I should also add that something I don't feel I'm good at all is doing positive messages. It just doesn't really, not something that I'm attuned to. But trying to be positive on this. You can complete your California Small Biz Certification or nonprofit registration in 1 business day or less if, sorry, didn't mean to do that, if you have the information you need from your tax returns and business documents at hand to enter into the online system. Now, I probably need to add this back in, because if I were the California Small Business Group, I would hate to be getting emails. But honestly, it says, how can it take 1 business day to finish your registration? It really can't take that long. It's bad that it takes that long. But I mean, the information, what I was trying to include, what I was trying to emphasize here is you can do it in 1 business day if you have the information. You could do this another way, and it's a question of what you want to emphasize. If you have the information you need, I think that I would be more tempted, to go with the second one. If you have the information you need, you can complete, because it's like a pre-existing condition. If you have the information you need, 1 business day. This is positive. You can do this in 1 day, but it puts the requirements sort of further away. So I don't know if anyone has any feedback on positive edits. I still want to know why it takes 1 business day. Did we have any questions on either of those?
There's a question, is at hand really necessary? What does that mean?
Well, what I understand it to mean, which is not necessarily what it means, is right next to you on your desk, within reaching distance. but that may not be what it means. And I would say that I've been using this in classes and at least one person asks. So I am tempted to believe that at hand is either a regionalism or, something else, that this is not absolutely understandable. So, I mean, that's a good catch. Are there any other questions about this? I think we have a couple more exercises.
Another question from Udit. I had heard that items in a list should begin with the same type of word, noun, subject, or verb. You should not begin a list with one item being a noun and the other item in the same list with subject or another verb. Is that correct or incorrect?
That's parallelism. You want items in a list to be parallel, so that if you have a list that is mostly nouns and you have a couple of verbs sprinkled in, then you have to make them match. They all have to match. This is very much like the Sesame Street thing. Some of these things belong together. Some of these things are kind of the same. In a parallel list, they all have to be the same. Sometimes that can be a little awkward, but yeah. Like here with the parallel lists, these are all 2 plus a verb, 2. And that's what makes them parallel.
One more question. When is it okay to use passive sentences?
Well, that was a section previously. There's a slide that lists all the possibilities for passive voice. When the doer is unknown, when the actor, the person doing the action, is unknown or doesn't matter, or the receiver of the action is more important than the doer. There's a couple of slides with that. I don't know if we mentioned it, but we're obviously recording this, and we'll be sending out the deck and the exercises. We already sent out the exercises, I thought. We'll send out the deck, so you will have that. That will not happen until next week. Were there other questions? Here's some more lists. Failure to file an answer within the 30-day period may be treated as consent to the award requested unless the department or other agency, let's see, that didn't work. Requests an extension of time for filing, or somebody do some, shouting about formatting for me, please. Thank you. So this is, again, you look for parallelism. Unless the department or other agency requests an extension of time for filing or files a statement. Requests and files are parallel. And those are the two things that have to happen, unless it's, something, failing to file an answer is going to be consent, unless these two things happen. This is an interesting point about parallelism. Superintendent or area director will provide a written notice. And here's where we have the list. We have specifying the action that we will take under this part and explaining the reason for the action. And now we have a problem. Let's see, shall we just make this delivering, because we have to make it parallel. Delivering the notice to you And okay, well, we don't need the notice, and we don't want will include. What we want is including. But what doesn't work? We've got specifying, we've got explaining, we've got delivering, we've got the including. So what things is the written notice going to do? It's going to be specifying, it's going to be explaining, and it's going to be including, but it is not going to be delivering. You know, that is not going to fit. So what we're going to have to do is take this out, get the list up, and change this to we will deliver the notice to you by certified mail or in person. And I would also clean up the punctuation. This is, you know, if you have something that's not going to fit and you can't make it fit, then it doesn't belong. You know, this is why, you know, it can't be ing. This is not something that defines notice. Were there any questions on that one? I mean, I have done these before, and it's not new to me, as it may be to you.
There's a question here. Could you talk a bit about using scientific or technical language when writing for a broad general audience? How do you decide
Okay.
to define a term versus figuring out another way to explain something?
Well, I would always use the term, but I would always then include an explanation of it, and you know, in plainer language. I know that Alan Alda does a lot of science communication training. He's got a center devoted to it, and he's got a podcast that explains, you know, some of how he gets scientific explanations. It's always helpful, I think, if there's a generic term, like, you know, science is a really broad topic, and I'm thinking of, you know, volcanoes for no particular reason, but, you know, you might have something like, I'm making this up, this is not a thing, but fossil shelf based earthquakes, maybe. And since that's probably new to a lot of people, you would have to start with fossil shelf earthquakes are a type of earthquake caused by, you know, fossilized shelves. See what I've gotten myself into. You know, thousands of feet below the surface, often found near oceans. You know, you've got to sort of provide some sort of general explanation. I really do a lot better with an example. If you have something specific you can send me, I'd be happy to, you know, look at it and try and give you some better reactions than my making up an example. Was there another question, Alex?
Is there an easy way to tell when a word should be hyphenated?
That is a style guide issue, and sometimes hyphenation depends on what dictionary your agency uses and depends on for that. Literally for breaking, I know that we've had to keep a list of words that we hyphenate and some that we do sometimes. Generally, let's see, generally you use hyphens when you're using two or more words to describe a noun that follows. Like, this has nothing to do with the example, but I was looking at things like fast breaking news. You know, you're using these two words to modify news. You don't generally use a hyphen if you're using an adjective ly. You know, you don't use that. Like if you, so if you have if you say like quickly breaking news, which is terrible, but you would not use the hyphen here that you used up here because you've got the ly, which indicates that it's an adverb and it's modifying breaking. I'm not sure that that is particularly helpful. One of the things that I have found to be very useful is the Purdue Online Writing Lab. I mean, there are some times when I can't think of the reason for something. I just really know the rule. So I look it up on the Online Writing Lab, and they have explanations of things like, you know, hyphens, or they have a good explanation of that and which, or they talk about possessives and things like that. So, I mean, you can just Google Purdue OWL Online Writing Lab. So that's a useful. I wanted to do one table, I think, at least. And if you have other questions, we'll just use the remainder of the time for that. But this is the information we have. This is actually confusing to follow. So it's really helpful to be able to say, like, estimated stumpage value, and then number of days the ad has to run. I don't know anything about estimated stumpage value except this. So so it has to be 15 days. Let's see. I'm guessing I had a correction from a student another time, and I'm hesitant to just write 50 to 250K, but that might possibly. So, I mean, that's one of the virtues of doing tables that allows that kind of thing. There's also this one. I think it's reasonably straightforward, so maybe you could try it on your own. But Alex, do we have other questions? Do we have outstanding questions in the queue? I'm happy to try and answer them.
Would it be acceptable to leave off the punctuation in the bulleted list in example 2?
Okay. Punctuation is not generally a plain language issue, so I would say follow whatever style guide your agency follows. So some people do, you know, punctuation, some people leave it open. You know, there's a couple of different styles. Use the one your agency uses. And about that particular issue, I mean, not bullet punctuation, but punctuation in general, the hyphen question. Apparently AP Style has changed its hyphenation guidance. So things that I'm used to hyphenate may not be hyphenated anymore according to AP.
Should it be between $50,000 to $250,000?
Well, my question, the question that the student said before was, oh, maybe it needs to be 250,001. Yeah. Because they were saying, okay, we've got some slippage here, and I think that would be, you know, something the agency would have to pronounce on.
Instead of specifics, how about states from bullet 1 last example?
Which one?
I think from the first bullet of the last example, instead of specifics, how about states? I'm not sure. Specificies. Specifies.
The superintendent or area director?
I believe so, yeah.
Well, that's fine. You could make that specifies, but you'd also have to say explains and includes. I mean, that's the thing. If you make a change when things are parallel, you do have to fix everything else to make, to make them stay parallel.
So a few more comments in the chat about the range of money example.
Mm-hmm. Anything different from what we've already discussed?
In 2, can you combine the last sentence with the introductory sentence?
The is that the for the second table example? Did I misunderstand something?
I believe yes, in that one.
Okay, the point of this example is tables, what can be made into a table. So we weren't looking to switch the order of the sentences. Let's go ahead and who made the decision? I'm filling out the table header. Let's see. Okay, so there's 2 sections here, who made the decision and whom you can appeal to. So if somebody made it, let's see, agency superintendent, you can appeal to the area director. But if the area director made it, you can appeal to the commissioner. But if the commissioner made it, no appeal. Yeah. So the whole point is not to rephrase the example, but to see how it turns into a table. Sometimes you can see that sort of thing with a workflow, which is what this essentially is.
Question from Marcia. With 508 compliance training, they suggest we avoid tables where possible. How do you balance between plain language needs and 508 compliance needs?
I don't generally find that there's a tension between the two because it's, I think 508 and plain language are working together. I understand that some tables may not be, it is possible to make 508 accessible tables on web pages. It may not be quite as easy to do it maybe on paper. I'm guessing. I don't know about that. Were there some other questions coming up? Well, if there aren't any questions, I suppose that I can give you back 10 minutes in your day. Thank you for joining us. As I said, we've recorded this. We're going to put this on DigitalGov later, and we'll be sending out the deck. And I believe you already got the exercises. I can add the exercises if you'd like to see the answers. I don't know what you did beforehand. If you have any more questions, I'm happy to answer them. Alex, anything from you? Gabby, anything from you?
Great job. Great job today, Catherine.
Thank you, and thank you for all your help with the polls. That was very exciting.
Absolutely, absolutely. And to everyone, there will be a post-event email coming out from Eventbrite, and there will be a survey. Very quick, if you all wouldn't mind completing it, that would be great. And yeah, until next time.
That would be wonderful. And if you have any ideas about future training, whether you'd like to try something more like a workshop, maybe with fewer people and more interactivity, you know, let us have your suggestions and we'll see what we can manage to do.
All right, everyone. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. Really appreciated your time and attention.